It is my great pleasure to introduce our gala speaker tonight, Michelle MiJung Kim. Michelle is a queer immigrant, Korean American woman, writer, speaker, and activist. She's also a fellow Cal Bear. Do we have any Cal Bears in the room? I love to see it. She's the author of The Wake Up, Closing the Gap Between Good Intentions and Real Change. And if you haven't seen already, you can purchase a signed copy of her book in the lobby from East Wind Books. They're also from Berkeley. Also, shout out to East Wind Books because they are Asian owned. So we're very proud to have them here with us tonight. Michelle is also the CEO and co-founder of Awaken, where she's consulted hundreds of organizations and leaders from Fortune 500 companies, tech giants, nonprofits, and universities on their equity education journey. Michelle has been a lifelong social justice activist and has served on a variety of organizations, such as the San Francisco Human Rights Commission's Advisory Committee, the Lyric Board of Directors, and the Build Tech We Trust Coalition. She currently serves on the board of Asian Americans for Civil Rights and Equality. And this is the truncated version of all of her achievements. So we are so pleased to welcome, please join me in giving a round of applause to Michelle MiJung Kim, who will be joined by AABA President Lisa Mak for a fireside chat.
Hello. Hello. Okay. Thank you, Michelle, for being here with us tonight and for having this conversation with our community, especially during this critical time. I'd like to start off by hearing more about your personal journey into the social justice space and the diversity and inclusion space. When and how did you start getting involved in that work?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to try again. Hi! It's wonderful to be here, and what an honor to be a part of this distinguished guest. And this evening, I'm so thrilled to be here. And I planted my fans in the back, so that's who you're going to be hearing from. Yep. Thanks, Mary Beth. So my name is Michelle MiJung Kim, and I use she, her pronouns. And really my journey began when I started really understanding about my own lived experiences. So everything that I do, whether it is activism work or my writing or just being in community, is informed by my lived experiences and my identities as a queer Asian woman, as a Korean American, as somebody who grew up low income with an undocumented father. So I think sometimes we forget how important these lived experiences are in guiding the way that we approach the work of social justice, because I really believe that the work of social justice is about human lives. It's about human work. It's about trauma work. So that's really what informed my journey. And I became politicized as a youth activist when I was in high school. When I first came out as being queer and bisexual, I was really active in the queer youth organizing space. And that led me to going to Berkeley, because I was so drawn to the legacy of the free speech movement and wanted to be a part of a community that was conscious about social justice work at large. And then I did a 180 and decided to go into management consulting after graduating from school because of this thing that I needed called money. My mother was still living in South Korea and we had been separated, and I really wanted to bring her over here. And the message that I received from people who were familiar with my financial situation was that you should probably not go into organizing full-time or even a nonprofit if you want to be able to afford the very expensive, as you all know, the legal process of bringing my mother here. And when I got to doing consulting work and more broadly in corporate America, I realized the way that people were talking about what they call diversity and inclusion was so disconnected from the work that I was used to. the grassroots social justice work and the organizing work on the front lines. And I felt as though the D&I work inside corporate America felt very diluted, very whitewashed, and oftentimes white-led, that did not center the voices and the experiences of the real marginalized people inside the company. So I had this massive cognitive dissonance around what it is that we're doing inside corporate America. And I thought that I would be joining a much more progressive space when I decided to join the tech world. I was sold by the idea of the casual progressiveness, and there I experienced even more of a cognitive dissonance of how people were treating the work of equity and justice that was devoid of the principles of social justice, which is what led me to ultimately leaving the world of tech and starting my own company called Awaken, which provides equity education that's grounded in social justice, that's led by BIPOC people. And this book kind of is a culmination of some of those lessons learned and my journey as a queer Asian woman in this country.
Thank you for sharing that. And speaking of your book, The Wake Up, Closing the Gap Between Good Intentions and Real Change. It was released last year. Congratulations. It's a beautifully written book. Really enjoyed reading it. So I want to ask you more about what made you decide to write the book, and what kind of impact are you hoping to make with it?
Yeah. You know, when I do consulting work with large organizations and teams that are really motivated by the work of DEI, the question that I get is, you know, I get that this is really important. You don't have to sell me on the importance of this work. So what can we do? Tell me what to do. And that question sometimes is often a desire to do something that feels practical and actionable right away. And people end up rushing towards the list of to-dos in order to create lasting transformation. But it's not that simple, right? If systemic injustice and systemic oppression could be solved by a 1, 2, 3 checklist, we would have done it by now. So for me, the wake up isn't just about our waking up to other people's problems or the injustices in the world. I really think that the important part of the work that we often miss is our waking up to ourselves, waking up to our complicity in the systems of oppression in our daily lives, even despite our good intentions, waking up to our capacity to create change, not only outside, but within ourselves, and waking up to our full humanity and the breadth of the experiences that we often ignore in the midst of the world that we live in. So I think that's really what I was hoping to communicate with this book, is the nuance and the complexity, the contradictions and the paradox that we find ourselves in while doing this work, and giving ourselves permission to be messy, to be in the middle of the gray area, you know, not just the black and white. This is a checklist of things that we do, but really grappling with the difficulty that is this work of equity and justice, and really reclaiming the humanity that's missing in the intellectualized version of and the corporate version of this work.
Now I want to dive into some of the things you talk about in your book. There's a chapter in there about the double-edged sword of representation and how there are limits and burdens with the current framework of how we think about representation. Can you tell us more about that, especially as it relates to the AAPI community?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, representation is such a hot topic, and I think it's such an important milestone for us to be able to solve for and to celebrate when it happens, right? And I felt really motivated and inspired by some of the speeches that I heard this evening, people talking about how there weren't any Asian associates or lawyers that people can look up to. So I think having representation is such an important way for us to seed possibility in people's minds, for people to know what's possible, people to understand that, you know, there are folks that have paved the way that we can follow along. And I caution people in terms of celebrating representation and representation only as a marker of progress of solving for justice for all, right? Because I believe, and I've experienced sadly, being really excited about people who look like me in positions of power and wanting to work with them and wanting to, really see myself in their work, and being gravely disappointed by the same patterns of injustice and inequity and systems of oppression that they end up upholding, just with a different face. And so I think in order for us to really make progress in terms of equity and justice, we need representation plus more, in terms of really disrupting the status quo, really stopping the pattern of injustice, and not just celebrating, being tokens of our community. And I think the tricky part and the complexity there is sometimes we also expect, in a disproportionate way, the labor to be done by people of different marginalized identities and who are underrepresented once they hold positions of power. And I think that's also something that we need to interrogate when we are quick to celebrate the most minute efforts of white leaders, and yet when we see underrepresented people who finally make it to their positions of power, we end up demanding a lot from them in a way that we don't of the majority folks. So, I think it's a really nuanced topic, the representation and the limits, as well as the benefits and the urgency of representation, and also wanting us to be really critical about how we create change beyond just putting people who look like us in positions of power, but not at all doing the work to dismantle the systems of oppression.
So another hot topic that we talk a lot about these days is the concept of allyship. And I really liked how in your book you talk about the possible harm of misguided allyship or performative allyship, and how you encourage your readers to really think about why they're doing the social justice work and why they're working for change. And you have a whole chapter about knowing your why. And one of my favorite quotes from there is on page 34, and you wrote, "The deepest why comes from our intimate understanding of how all of our struggles are inextricably tied, and how there can be no true liberation without all of us being active participants in dismantling all forms of oppression. Oppression harms everyone, albeit to different degrees, regardless of the role we play. Commit to realizing that systems of oppression that seemingly do not hurt us actually do, even when we benefit from them simultaneously." So can you share more about that, your thoughts about that concept and how we should be grounding our approach to allyship and how to show up for others?
Yeah, absolutely. So back in 2020, at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, our community was also experiencing a lot of anti-Asian violence. And when those two really traumatic events converged, I started writing about the importance of fighting anti-Black racism within the community that I'm a part of. And I started getting a lot of messages of disappointment from Asian people in my network and also on social media. Michelle, how could you be talking about fighting anti-Black racism when our people are dying? How could we be doing marching for Black Lives Matter when we are not getting the attention that we need? And I deeply felt I felt a lot of pain and heartache from getting those messages, and I understood how deep the trauma and the pain for our community was in terms of experiencing perpetual erasure and invalidation of our pain and the violence that we're experiencing in our world today. And it also made me realize how one-dimensional we have been talking about this work of allyship, and how for some people this allyship felt almost like a transactional exchange where it's, I showed up for you, so you need to show up for me. And I think the danger of that is we end up fighting our battles in silos. And what I really wanted folks to understand is when I march for Black lives, I'm not just marching for Black people in my life and my Black friends. I'm actually marching for our people, for my people. Because when I march for Black Lives Matter, I'm fighting against the same systems of oppression that are oppressing my people. And I'm trying to dismantle the systems of white supremacy that's also killing our people too. And I think this plays out in so many different ways. When we talk about sexism and dismantling the patriarchy, we often think that men should care because they have women in their lives that they want to fight for. But I want men to fight against the patriarchy and sexism, not just because they have women in their lives, but because it's the same force that's robbing them of their opportunity to be vulnerable, their opportunity to be at home with their children without repercussions. And I want us to be fighting for trans people, not because we have trans friends, but because the gender binary is killing us too. It's robbing us the opportunity to go beyond the gender norms. So I think these are the exercises and the connecting of the dots that's really, really important. And when we talk about, how do we get people who don't care to care? That's probably one of the biggest questions one of the most frequently asked questions that I get when I work with, organizations of all sizes. And they're usually talking about white people in positions of power, right? And leaders who don't seem to care, who don't seem to get these issues. And similarly, I explain to them, it's not just trying to convince white people to care about their people of color colleagues. It's actually displaying and showing them that white supremacy is robbing them of their humanity as well. So how do we actually do this work? Not from a place of trying to save other people, but trying to fight for ourselves and trying to see ourselves in all of the systems of oppression that we are trying to battle, right? How do we make sure that we are seeing this battle as a battle for our humanity? Because all of our injustice and all of our liberation is bound together. And I really hope that's the place of, that's a foundation that we start to build when we start talking about allyship. It's not just from a place of trying to save anyone, but it's actually a battle of all of our humanity.
So there's been a lot going on in our communities, a lot of injustice and trauma and fear and pain. I think many of us want to help and do something and create change for ourselves and for our community, but we feel overwhelmed and sometimes discouraged and we don't know where to start. Do you have any advice for us about that?
Therapy is great.
That's a good start.
And I hope it was more accessible to people. So if y'all are in positions of power where you can make therapy accessible to your employees, please do. And I think about the notion in racial trauma work. We often talk about how collective trauma needs to be healed collectively. And so gatherings like this, for me, is a reminder of our collective power and how we get to do this not alone, but together. And I think the work it can be so overwhelming. And sometimes it can be so easy for us to become jaded by the fact that these systems that we're battling against are so big and so archaic, and they've been in place for so long. I mean, you all are living inside some of the most, institutionally powerful systems and that have a lot of legacy and history behind. So I can only imagine for some of you who are doing the work to undo some of the inequities that are inherent in the systems, how difficult and exhausting it must be. And I always remind people to think about this work as intersecting and that's always connected. So focusing on your own sphere of influence, on what you can control immediately in your surrounding, I think is the best way to tackle this. And I think about this work as almost like a tapestry. And every systems of oppression and the injustice that we experience are woven together. So when we start to pull at the thread that's right in front of us, we're going to be able to do that all together in a way that can unravel the tapestry together. And they're always going to connect at some point. So if you can be in charge of your own backyard and your front line, my friend Kalea Mendoza, who's an incredible activist and grassroots organizer, talks about how, the front line isn't just marching on the streets with a protest sign. The front line is wherever you're doing the work. So all of you have your own front yard and your front line where the battle is happening. The sphere of influence that you have control over, whether it's your family, your friends, your team, your community, your neighborhood, your school, your church. I think all of those spheres of influence can benefit from one person starting that conversation and taking action. So when you start to feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of injustice that's in front of us, I want you to remember to do just one thing at a time. What's one thing that I can control today? And where is my sphere of influence that I can control? And the last thing I'll say is one of the greatest advice that I received in my life came from a fortune cookie from Panda Express. I was an intern at a consulting firm, and the fortune cookie Fortune said, "Don't give in to cynicism." And I think that is probably one of the most profound advice that I've gotten in my life.
From a fortune cookie.
From a fortune cookie.
Okay.
Yes. Don't ignore those fortune cookies. I always open mine. And if you want it to come true, you have to eat the whole thing. And I say this to a lot of young people that I mentor and I talk to who end up going into corporate spaces and are starting work for the first time. Because I think the experience that I had was really jarring and I was disillusioned really quickly. I went into the workplace thinking, I'm going to create change from within. And I was quickly met with a lot of roadblocks and a lot of negative repercussions each time I tried to speak up about something that I felt wasn't right. And I think over time, it's so easy for us to get jaded. It's so easy for us to say, you know what, this is never going to change. You know, you're just being the hippie Berkeley girl. I heard that a lot. She's from Berkeley. And I think it's really easy for us to give into cynicism in this world. I think that is how our world is built. And to be broken down and to be called, oh, you're being so idealistic, you're being so naive. And we mistake somebody's optimism and somebody's courage to be able to be hopeful with naivete. So I just want to remind people who are holding on to hope that change is possible, that is the courageous thing to do. The easier thing to do is to give into cynicism and be jaded, that change isn't possible in our lifetime. The ability to hope for a better world is what seeds change every single time. And I think that's the message that I live with every single day and hold on to the stories of possibility and working alongside people who are pushing toward change despite all the people and all the systems that say it's not possible. And I feel that that's not possible if we're not in community with each other. So I feel really inspired and hopeful sitting here and, you know, listening to all of the amazing speeches and seeing the wonderful and hearing about the wonderful work that all of you are doing. So thank you all for the work that you do and for gathering in community to do this together.
So thank you again, Michelle. We're just about out of time, but I want to thank you again for this conversation, for being here with us tonight, and for all the work and advocacy that you do for our community. We so appreciate you. And I know you wanted to end tonight with reading a passage from your book.
So I'm going to be reading a passage from a chapter that wasn't meant to be in the book that ended up going in here because of the tragedy that happened in Atlanta. So I just want to give a quick content warning. So if folks want to step out, because I am going to be talking about the shooting that happened in Atlanta. It's important to understand that the Atlanta shooting did not happen in a vacuum. It didn't happen because one bad white man woke up one morning and decided to shoot up 3 massage parlors. That would be an overly reductive yet convenient narrative of white supremacy that distances us from the heinous murders. Instead, we need to understand violence and its long buildup in context and see ourselves playing an active role in it. How have we, as a society and as individuals, been complicit in perpetuating racialized, gendered, and classed violence against working-class Asian women in our daily lives, whether through erasure, reinforcing biased narratives, or being a bystander to different levels of harm? How have we benefited from the systems that rely on the oppression of Asian people, immigrants, women, low-wage migrant workers, sex workers, and all marginalized people? And what have we done to actively disrupt them? How have we been part of the conditions that gave birth to this attack? And what must we shift in ourselves, with one another, and in every sphere of influence we find ourselves in, from our workplace to school, family, church, neighborhood, and more, to ensure this type of violence never happens again? How could we center and support the needs of the survivors, not only those impacted by the massacre, but also those who have been and continue to be impacted by the same systems of oppression? We each have a role in this work, and we must take the work of transforming ourselves and our relationships seriously to transform the world, because our transformation is part of the liberatory tools that we need to dismantle all forms of oppression. By replacing the master's tools, we can begin our process of reimagining and becoming the solutions that keep us safe for good.
Thank you, Michelle. Let's give another round of applause for Michelle MiJung Kim. Thank you so much.